It's kind of funny how things tend to happen in bursts. Right after I did my fairly recent video about the GMX 2000 3D Labs video card, and specifically called out a handful of other 3D Labs cards, I came into this huge pile of other graphics cards from similar vintage. They're pretty much all workstation-oriented graphics cards, and almost all of them are 3D Labs, but there's a couple other oddballs in the mix. And I got these through a combination of acquisitions at estate sales and garage sales and that kind of thing, and a couple donations to the channel. So let's go ahead and take a look at this giant bag of workstation graphics cards. Let's go ahead and take a look at this big pile of video cards. Now, I'm going to go through a bunch of these pretty quickly because a few of them are going to show up later in longer videos and get more time dedicated to them. A lot of these cards are 3D Labs cards, and as a follow-up to my previous video about the GMX 2000, 3DLabs.com seems to have come back to life, and while I'm filming this, I'm also downloading every driver for every piece of hardware for every operating system just to have it archived just in case. I'm going to go through these cards in reverse chronological order. So I'm going to start with the newest card and work back approximately to the oldest. Here on the top is basically the last card in this family line. This is the GVX 420. I don't think they knew at the time when they were naming it that, that this would be the GVX Smokey McPots edition. So this card is for its time, which I want to say this came out in 1999, maybe 2000. It was a very rare double width card, and it was double width, also connecting to AGP and to the adjoining PCI slot for two reasons. One, they needed a bunch of extra space to be able to fit all these connectors. It's got two VGA, two DVI, and a port for 3D shutter glasses. But I believe it also needed the extra PCI connection for the power draw. So this has got, I want to say, 128 megabytes of RAM. It has two of the R4 rasterizers, which these are the successor rasterizer chips to the VX1 from my previous video. And then it also, hiding underneath here, has a Gamma G2 geometry chip. It's easy to say. So this is the successor to the geometry chip that's on the GMX 2000. After this card came out, 3D Labs had made a couple acquisitions, and as far as I can tell, they kind of went a different direction with their hardware architecture. And I believe after this card, pretty shortly after this card, is when the programmable Wildcat cards started to come out. So the cards that I would actually consider to be GPUs. This is a 3D accelerator. I don't call this a GPU because I can't write programs that run on it. It's all what we would call fixed function. So this is kind of working backwards. So in between these two, there was another card, the GVX 210, that is a single Gamma G2 and a single R4 rasterizer, and I want to say 64 megs of RAM. It was half the size. Going back a step even further is the GVX1 Pro, which is, again, a G2 geometry chip and a single R4 rasterizer with 64 megabytes of RAM. And this also has the DVI port, the 3D glasses port, and a VGA port. Going back even further is this card, and this was the card that I had specifically called out in my my GMX 2000 video as a card that I really wanted to try. This is the R3 rasterizer from that VX1 video card, but a Gamma G1. They sort of renamed it the G1 as the first generation geometry processor to drive it. This card also has 32 megs of RAM. And there's a couple of annoying bits about this card. So one, it uses the same irritating, billion RPM fan, and this one, the adhesive has failed and it has become detached, and there's a little bit of the adhesive left kind of hanging on there. So I'm going to have to clean that up and figure out some sort of cooling solution. This does have a little bit of an aluminum block around it to act as a heat sink, but I just feel like a design like this would have just provided better cooling. There's the other thing I forgot to mention about this card that I thought was interesting is it's got these heat sinks and it has connectors for fans, but there's no fans there. I found that kind of interesting. The other annoying thing about this card, and every review that you can find of this card from back in the day complains about this, is instead of using DVI, this card uses what is called a VESA DFP port, or sometimes it's also called an MDR20. It's a 20-pin monitor connector port, which they used instead of DVI for reasons I don't really understand. The thing about this port is it only supports up to 1280 by 1024. On the VGA, it supports a full up to 2048 by whatever resolution. But on the digital port, you get crummy 1280 by 1024. There is a passive adapter that converts it to DVI. And these adapters are available in both directions. There were some monitors that used this DFP port. I believe, according to Wikipedia, some compact Presario monitors. I expect there are probably very, very few of those left existing in the. There are probably more of these GVX1 cards in the world than there are those monitors left in the world. I had originally thought that maybe they used this port because it's physically smaller and was going to be easier to fit everything on the end of the card. But the thing is, this card has exactly the same configuration of ports, and they managed to get everything to fit with DVI. And this DFP port isn't really smaller. Like, the connector is smaller, but then it has this extra hardware on it for the connection and needs a little bit of extra space around it. So there really isn't any savings. So I don't understand. If anyone has any idea why they would have picked this port over DVI at this time, I would love to know about it. Please say something in the comments, because it is a great mystery to me. Now, back in the day, we didn't have video cards that had a bazillion outputs on them to be able to drive, your giant display wall with a single card. Instead, there were monsters like this. Now, this is effectively 4 PCI Permidia 2s on a single card with a PCI to PCI bridge. There were a bunch of cards made like this back in the day that were primarily based either on Permidia 2. There were a couple other cards other than this Appian card that used the Permidia 2 in this kind of configuration. There were also a handful of cards based on, I want to say, Matrox G200, although maybe it was G100. I'm pretty sure there was G200 based cards, but I don't think anything newer than that, because once you got very much past that cards could just drive multiple monitors on their own. Now, this particular card has a monster of a connector that looks like a 68-pin SCSI connector. And what that goes to is this beast of a cable. So one end connects to the card, and the other end drives your 4 VGA ports. Sometimes these sort of cables are referred to as Medusa cables because it kind of is reminiscent of Medusa's hair of snakes. And these crazy special cables like this often disappear, and without this cable, this card is, it's e-waste. There's no use to it at all. So another card that I had specifically called out in my GMX 2000 video, it was the Elsa GLoria XL. This is what 3D Labs would have called a DMX 1000, because it's a glint delta coupled with a single MX rasterizer. There were also GMX 1000s, I guess. I'm not sure. Maybe that's what the XXL was. And that would be a gamma geometry chip with a single MX rasterizer. Now, this card is a little bit interesting because it has a SODIMM slot here to add additional texture memory for compared to what's already on here. So this will be an interesting card to compare with the GMX 2000 in a few benchmarks and some of the other cards. I'm kind of glad that I didn't already have this when I did that other video, because I already spent enough time messing around with this. But what makes this interesting is this is PCI. And so there's a lot more places I can put this card and some more interesting things I can do with that. So another oddball card that was in the donation lot is this card that I wouldn't have thought anything of when it came in the lot. Like, okay, it's a PCI VGA card. The person who gave it to me told me the reason that he kept it is supposedly this ARC 2000 chipset is the fastest DOS graphics platform. Now, I had thought that the ET6000 was the fastest, and I've got a couple ET6000s and a couple ET4000s and some of the various S3 trios that were also very fast PCI cards. So maybe come December, it'll be time to do, a multi-way shootout in some fast PC, era-appropriate PC in Doom or something like that. Something that will generate good benchmark numbers to see which one really is the fastest, once and for all. I couldn't even pretend to say that with a straight face. Another funny thing that came into my possession were these two cards. Now, this came in one of the donation lots, and this I found at an estate sale about 3 days apart. And these are basically the same card, except one is AGP and has a bunch of extra board space hanging out over here, and the other is PCI. Now, these are based on an Evans and Sutherland graphics chipset, and they use some crazy Mitsubishi memory and memory controller to do some very weird stuff. It's a super interesting architecture. Not very many cards were based on this. I'm super curious to see how this performs and to see what some of its quirks are. The one thing that's a huge bummer about these cards in general is if you look for one on eBay, a lot of times people have pulled this SODIMM or this DIMM thinking that it's just a regular SD-RAM DIMM, but it's not. It is special memory specifically for this card, and it's the texture RAM. So without this, I don't know if the card works at all or if you just get no texture mapping. Either way, there is great sadness. The neat thing about this card is one of the things they did is they put the Cirrus Logic chip on the back, which I thought was kind of neat. This one, I don't think. Oh yeah, it just has the extra, some of the additional RAM on the back. It will be, so these, and I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but a lot of these really early 3D accelerator cards, especially the workstation oriented cards, had a separate VGA chip on them just to provide BIOS and DOS compatibility, because they did not have chip space to implement all of VGA. It was just too much, right? They wanted to dedicate every single bit of silicon to their 3D accelerator because we were kind of pushing the limits and living on the edge of what was possible in silicon at that point. I mean, this is spread over, I mean, if you want to get technical about it, this 3D accelerator is spread over 4 chips. 5 if you want to count the external RAM DAC. So, you know, it's a big pile of chips, and they would have much rather used all of that space for their accelerator than for implementing VGA that once you get booted into Windows NT and have their drivers loaded, you're never going to use. And you're not buying these cards for DOS. You're just not. Or for Windows 95. This is another card where I don't think there are Windows 95 or Windows 98 drivers. I know for sure there are Windows NT 3.5.1 and 4.0 and Windows NT 4.0 drivers for it. I'm actually not 100% sure if there are drivers for anything later for like Windows 2000, and I'm not sure. That'll be an interesting test. But these are super old. I mean, the copyright date on this card is 1997, so this was reaching way back in time. These I know for sure are going to come back in a future video for sure. I have some fun things planned for at least this card. I haven't tested it yet, so I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that it works. If not, you know, there'll be much sadness. So that is the whole big giant pile of cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like. If you are interested in seeing any of the follow-up videos where some of these cards get dealt with in greater depth and I do some benchmarking and so on and so forth, please subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram, where I tend to post pictures about these things. I would have posted pictures of this stuff, but all of it came in so fast together that I just decided to do a hopefully quick video about it. So the links to that are in the description below. And until next time, try to remember the good stuff.